Some people say that IBB stands for It's Bob's Building, and of course they mean Bob Nerem, not Bob Goldberg. And in fact, in many ways, the Petit Institute is Bob's building because he had the vision to convince leaders like Wayne Clough to invest in the vision of creating an interdisciplinary space for scientists and engineers to come together.
What attracted me to come here in 1987 was the very entrepreneurial attitude. I still remember being told as part of the recruiting process, I think it was probably by Tom Stelson, who was then the vice president for research, Bob, you have to understand, Georgia Tech is what it is and is going to become what it's going to become, not because the state of Georgia wants it to be that good, but because the faculty, the administration, and the alumni want it to be that good.
Bob's personal qualities, I think, are probably number one is he's really a people person. He can remember names, life stories, where this person went to school. They've moved from this school to that school as far as faculty colleagues from whenever ago. Those kinds of things are not forgotten.
Good morning. Welcome to Georgia Tech and to the Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience, IBB, for the rest of the day. It's great to be here to celebrate Bob's life. I want to welcome everybody, especially the Nerem family. Marilyn, always great to see you. You know, this is your home too. And I want to welcome all our out-of-town guests. So I am Andres Garcia. I have the privilege to serve as the executive director of IBB and to build on the legacy that Bob has created here. Before we move into the program, I'm going to keep people on tight. I have a gong and a hook and the personality to wield them ruthlessly. I want to acknowledge the staff in IBB that put this together. We're an awesome organization, and really the staff reflect that. So I want to thank Collie, which doesn't want to be acknowledged, but she's back there. Angela, Christina, Andy, Jacob, Michelle, everybody, Steve, who will be speaking. So thank you to the staff. And with that, it is my pleasure to have Georgia Tech's current president, Dr. Angel Cabrera. Welcome, everybody. Angel.
I had prepared these notes, and then I heard Professor Garcia, and I saw the gong, and I know he means business. So I'm not even going to try. I am so delighted that we're doing this. Marilyn, your entire family, thank you so much for being here. And so I did not have the honor of working with Bob, and yet I have enjoyed tremendously his legacy. I've always felt like you have some faculty members that you get to know throughout the years who are great because they were great teachers, and they inspire new generations, and they launch new careers. And then you meet others who have been just great scientists and have made breakthrough contributions to science and their field. And then there is also the kind that builds institutions and communities and leave legacies of excellence behind. And it is to that category that Bob clearly not only belongs, but he, in a way, helps define. So I arrived to Georgia Tech, and I found a series of amazing head-scratching aspects of Georgia Tech. One of them was this Department of Biomedical Engineering, and people around the world asked me, how in the world could that arrangement work? Two different universities, one public, one private, with very different sort of cultures and governance systems, agreeing to create a program that not only has survived throughout the years, but is thriving. That's head scratcher number one. And then I got to also hear and learn about even programs that we do that reach out into the community, like the Project Engages, and how we're bringing high school students who have never had science role models and come here and their lives get transformed. I'm like, oh my gosh, I had no idea we did this. This is powerful. And all of those and many more always led to that man. So I actually like that sort of profiled, because in a way, it's like, I feel like the shadow that his work and his legacy has projected on this community and the extended community is absolutely amazing. So all I can tell you is that even though I did not have the honor, and I can't wait to hear some of the stories of those of you who knew Bob personally, I feel blessed with enjoying the legacy that he has left us behind. Thank you so much for having me, Andres, and thank you for not using the gong on me.
Gracias, Angel.
Hello, I'm Wayne Clough, President Emeritus of Georgia Tech, and welcome all of you to the Nerem Symposium, particularly Marilyn Nerem, who was Bob's lifelong partner. I came to Georgia Tech from the University of Washington, where I was provost and vice president for academic affairs. And while there, I became very interested in the fields of cellular and molecular biology and biomedical engineering, and how engineering would have a role in a field that largely had been dominated by science before. So when I came to Georgia Tech, I asked who I should talk to about this, and the name Bob Nerem popped up right away. I found he was a distinguished faculty member. He was a member of the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Medicine. Nobody else at Georgia Tech had that distinction. Bob and I shared this enthusiasm for what we thought was a really change coming in the way of the future of engineering. And of course, he, being an opportunist, came back to me about a month later and asked if I would support a proposal to renovate space in one of the oldest buildings on campus for his program. And I looked at him and I said, Bob, you know, we both think this field has enormous potential, and renovating a space in an old building is not the right way to go. Think bigger. So he came back with another proposal to build a small building near the old building. And fortunately that I didn't go anywhere, because by that time I'd hired Bob Thompson from the University of Washington, who was very creative in understanding how federal research funding could be used to build new buildings. So we surprised Bob by telling him we were going to build an entirely new building. And Bob took that to heart and came back with a really innovative proposal with interdisciplinary faculty in that building in a way Georgia Tech had never done. That was very exciting. Well, other things happened while we were building that building. One of them was a chance meeting at Atlanta Hartsfield Airport between Bob, where he spent a lot of time, and Mike Johns, who was Vice President of Health Affairs at Emory. And Mike said to Bob, look, we have a great School of Medicine, you have a great College of Engineering, we shouldn't try to duplicate these things, let's put this together and create a joint program. Well, that was just music to my ears. I was so excited about that, and we took that up right away. A second phenomenon or opportunity arose when Bob developed a proposal for a Center of Excellence with the National Science Foundation in the area of engineering of living tissues. We were against the big boys there, and we weren't as optimistic as we thought we should be, but we got a site visit. And when the team came and had their visit and then had their last discussion session, they asked me to come, and we also had Bill Todd there, who was the president of the Georgia Research Alliance. And they asked the question, where are you going to get the matching money for this center, which is a significant amount of money? And Bill Todd stood up and said, if you will, I will. And the team looked at him and said, what do you mean by that? He says, you ask for the matching money, whatever it is, and I will make sure Georgia Tech gets it. Well, that was a phenomenal ending to the meeting. And so as a result, Georgia Tech won that Center of Excellence. Now, later on, I had the honor to serve on the board of directors of the National Science Foundation. And I took great pride in walking by the plaque that talked about this center, to the point I may have irritated some of the people I told them about this over and over, because I was so proud of that center and what it meant to Georgia Tech and its ability to lift its sights as an institution. So I was very lucky to know Bob Nerem. I was very lucky to have him as a faculty member here. He helped me do so many of the things that sometimes I get credit for, which I don't deserve. But I love Bob. Now, in addition, you should know Bob had bigger interests than just his field. He worried about his students. He worried about kids in high school who didn't have the money to go to places like Georgia Tech. He raised money for those causes on his own. So Bob had this wonderful love for life, love for other people, empathy for other people, and a caring attitude. And that's what made him not only a great faculty member, but also a great person. And for that, we love Bob, we miss Bob, and we thank him for all he did for us. So my best regards to you, and enjoy the symposium. Thank you.
Good morning. I regret that I'm not able to be there with you today to celebrate the life and distinguished career of Dr. Bob Nerem. Bob was a distinguished scholar, a curious and innovative researcher, a prolific author, and a much beloved mentor. And as much as he hated to admit it, he was an outstanding administrator. Trained as a mechanical engineer, Bob had a tremendous impact on his students, his colleagues, and the many institutions where he worked. I know that you're all very familiar with his many accomplishments, so I'll not try to elaborate on these here. Instead, I want to focus on what I found most inspiring about Bob. Bob had a love for fundamental research, and he evolved from his early work on the physiology of launch vibrations to how those vibrations affected blood flow. This early work led to his study of molecular and cellular biology, tissue engineering, and ultimately stem cell therapeutics. In the latter stages of his career, Bob migrated towards what had been a lifelong interest, and that's the development of young scholars, and in particular young aspiring scholars for whom the pursuit of a research-based or academic career, for whatever reason, may not have even seemed possible. This led him to the development of Project Engages, which has exposed hundreds of students to the world of engineering, science, and technology through real-world, hands-on research projects led by practicing scientists and exposing these students to career path possibilities that they may never have even imagined. In all of his work, Bob had high expectations. He could be demanding at times, but he was a man of principle, one who was precise in his thinking and in what he said and how he said it. He was very direct. You never wondered where you stood with Bob, but he always was willing to provide advice or lend a helping hand. In thinking about today and Bob, I was reminded of our first encounter. It was the first week or so of April in 2009, and I was less than a week into my new role as president of Georgia Tech. One of my first formal responsibilities was to preside over the annual Faculty and Staff Honors and Awards ceremony, where I was to present Bob with the Class of 1934 Distinguished Professor Award, one of Tech's highest honors. Now, although I was brand new to Tech, I knew that there was a previous president named Joseph M. Pettit, and that Bob was the founding director of the Parker H. Petit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience. But at that time, I was not sure of the pronunciation. So while walking over to the event, I asked one of my colleagues who I thought would surely know. As you might guess, when the time came, I introduced Bob as the founding director of the Parker H. Pettit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience. Bob took the podium and was very gracious, but at the end of her remarks, he said, and these words are etched into my memory to this day, he said, "Far be it from me to correct our new president, but I'm the founding director of the Parker H. Petit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience." Afterwards, Bob came up to me and said somewhat apologetically, "I hope I didn't embarrass you, but if you're going to be successful in this job, you're going to have to get these things right." Over the ensuing years, Bob would tell that story, and together we would laugh about our first encounter. It's only one of the many fond memories of the experiences we had together. And as I think of Bob today, I think of the thousands of colleagues and students he touched, individuals that he interacted with throughout his career, who benefited from his advice and wisdom, and whose careers and lives he impacted so significantly. You see, Bob almost always got it right. Thank you, and enjoy the symposium.
Steve, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Andres. So already you can see there's a common theme because in my first interaction to Bob, he said exactly what it is he was thinking. I was hired on the same day as, Bob Goldberg and I had started on the very first day, and probably within a month or so, Bob had me to his house, and I got to meet Bob and Marilyn for the first time. The very first thing Bob said to me, because Bob Goldberg was standing next to me, he said, "I see you both are having a no-hair day." And that was Bob. I would say both. And by the way, I think he laughed more harder than either Bob Goldberg and I did. But that was Bob, right? I mean, you know where you stood. But I think that for me, that represented his disarming way. Here I was, brand new assistant professor, meeting a giant, and I think he already lowered, the barrier. And throughout the next 20 years of occasionally meeting Bob. I certainly didn't know Bob as well as many of the folks here, but at each point, he always treated me incredibly. He was friendly. He knew he had this incredible memory about what you were doing. And I think really, in many ways, that's the point about Bob. He was an incredible mentor to many folks, but even the folks that he wasn't close to, he made you feel that way. I would like to do a couple things to kind of introduce you to things that I know that you're going to hear a lot more about. You've already heard about Project Engages, and I want to give you a couple statistics to kind of cue up what I know you're going to hear from others. Already, more than 130 high school students have completed that program. 95 have received scholarships to study at top-ranked institutions. So as you've already heard, these are high school students. 6 have earned the prestigious Gates Millennium Scholarship. 12 have presented at national conferences, and 1 has even spoken at the White House. You're going to hear a lot more about it from Manu Plot and others. And of course, Bob was very, very proud of that program. The plea that I want to make today, kind of going off script, so get your Kleenex ready, but also please get your checkbooks and credit cards ready. Because I think if there's any way we really, truly want to honor Bob today, it would be through Engages. I know there are probably going to be other ways, but please think about that as the day goes on. I think the last thing I want to do is introduce you to Bob's rules of life that encapsulate not only the maxims he shared with the world, but also the essence of progress and service at Georgia Tech, and really is the very best that we have to offer. First, take care of yourself and others. Second, seize every opportunity to learn something new. And finally, strive to make the world a better place for everyone. And I know that that's what you're going to hear about today. Thank you for having me here. It's great to see you, Marilyn. And as Wayne Clough said, we loved Bob and we miss him.
Thanks, Steve. So our next speaker is Chawi Abdallah, who's the Executive Vice President for Research of Georgia Tech, and my boss. So, in addition to Angel, obviously.
Yeah, you have many bosses, as you know, but we all work for you too. So thank you so much. As he said, Chawi Abdallah, I'm the Executive Vice President for Research. I'm so glad to be here and to celebrate the life of Bob and the house that Bob built. So you've heard already about Bob's focus on people. I think on service also, and the principles, his rules of life. In his 33 years at Georgia Tech, he helped to shape Georgia Tech research as well as the education and the service mission. So it's no accident then that we carry this through many of our activities, including an effort that we call here Research Next. It's our strategic plan for research. That is actually, our tenets are, it's people-centered, value-based, and data-informed. And we want to do research that matters, and that's certainly what Bob taught us, and that's what Bob did. He understood the interdisciplinary intersections and the value of working in interdisciplinary fields, including his leadership and his creation, his helping to create many of the international and national bioengineering organization, including of course, the NIH's National Institute for Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, as well as many others. He also found the time to serve on many boards, volunteering and otherwise. These organizations brought together communities of biomedical engineers from all over the world. So one of the other things you hear about is, of course, he spent a lot of time at the airports, and he had infinite energy to serve and to contribute. I did not know Bob well. I met him, probably 2 or 3 times, but I met him in a very nice social setting with Marilyn and so on. And, those are the memories that I remember is his wit. And I learned something. Every time I met Bob or I was with Bob, I learned something, either about the history of the field or about how he built the programs or about his passion about project engages, which I would second Steve's comment. If you want to honor Bob, project engages is a great, great opportunity to do so. This tradition carries over in the Wallace H. Coulter Department of Biomedical Engineering at Georgia Tech and Emory, which Bob also helped to build. And in that space, we are conducting research that matters with the goal of improving people's lives. You're going to hear about a lot of the stuff that I think is being conducted in this building or with the faculty and the students in here. As early as 1970, Bob saw the potential of biomedical engineering to improve people's lives. And I think his vision and commitment are a big reason why Georgia Tech and Emory Biomedical Engineering Department, the only department, by the way, at Georgia Tech, all of the others are schools, as I learned early in my career at Georgia Tech. The measure of a great life is that you leave the world a better place than you did. And certainly, Bob had a great life. So thank you again for inviting me to speak and enjoy the celebration. Thank you.
So, I'll sprinkle some comments throughout because Bob deserves a lot of credit. He put up with me, for 20-some years when I came to Georgia Tech. So this picture here, it's great. I love it. It's a great profile. But you know what it is? It's Bob falling asleep during a thesis defense. One of the things that I always found, and, in addition to being my mentor, my friend, my role model, I'm the first PhD, I'm the only PhD in my family, and I know how to act or behave. And I try to model a lot of my behavior around Bob because he was awesome, right? And I remember I would be in thesis committees, I'd be a first year, second year faculty member, I'd be at a thesis committee defense, and Bob would fall asleep on the second slide, okay? Like this, right? Like this, falling asleep. I'd be like, oh my God, right? And the thesis would end, and all throughout the presentation, I'm thinking, what am I going to ask this student that's going to sound smart and good, right? And then Bob would wake up and ask the most insightful, appropriate, question of the student. I was like, oh my God, right? This guy is just brilliant. So I'm glad we have that picture there because it reminds me of Bob doing that, and that showed really one of his tremendous skills. Okay, moving along, it's my pleasure to have our next speaker, Ravi Belanconda. Ravi has a long interactive history with Georgia Tech because Bob recruited Ravi to come here and was a faculty member and then became chair of BME. Then he took a mini leave to go to Duke and be the dean there, build a couple buildings, and now he's the provost at Emory University. So Ravi, welcome and great to have you here.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's actually wonderful to have Emory and Georgia Tech again on my name tag. Really, really wonderful. You'll hear a lot about the institution builder, and we did already. Hi, Marilyn. About Bob, and you'll also hear about the science. Truly visionary. But as it says there, I'll just reflect for a few minutes on the impact Bob has had on my life and by extension on our family's life. Lolita is here as well. It boils down ultimately to the place and the people. You heard about recruitment. And in many ways that defines who I am as a person today and what I do. I'll start with the place. I am an immigrant to this country. I came here in 1989 for graduate school to Providence, Rhode Island. And even in India, I never lived in any place for more than 3 years. My dad worked for the federal government, and we moved along in multiple cities. And this year marks 14 years of my being in Atlanta. I think Lolita's lived here for 15. And this is the closest place that I have to home anywhere in the world, including my childhood. And that came to be, as you've heard, and you'll hear again today, the incredible recruiter that Bob Nerem was. I never thought I would leave Case Western, where I was teaching then. We were doing well. We had multiple R01s and all this stuff. And Bob would just never stop recruiting, and relentless. He would call home. He would ask about Lolita, who's in a graduate program, when she was finishing. So he knew exactly when she was going to finish, so he could recruit us. So it's just unbelievable. And actually, Andres and Michelle had a lot to do with my coming here as well. So I'm very grateful we made that decision in 2003, and it has been my home for ever since, in every sense of the word. And really, we owe, our family does. Our daughter was born here. This is our home, and Bob had a lot to do with that. But the reason Bob was so successful in assembling this wonderful group of people, and many, many who are not here, is because of the people part of what Bob did. Ultimately, even for those of us who were outside, would go to the Hilton Head meetings, could easily see that this was not just a place. It was ultimately about the people. It was a family. It was a community. It was a community drawn together by science and place, but really it was about the community. And every part of our experience since coming here reflected that. This building and its design, GTech and the ERC that you heard about and how it was run, every event was family friendly, whether it was here, whether it's Lake Lanier, the retreats we used to have, the Hilton Head meeting, every sense and every opportunity, it was always about the people and the whole person and the families involved. He knew birthdays. He knew my travel schedule before I knew it, because I don't know how. He would say, you can't come to this event because you're not in town. I say, how do you know? So it's just incredible sense of community. And I'm just grateful, not only for recruiting me here, but he had a lot to do with the 14 years that I've stayed here multiple times. Like many people in this room, we got a lot of calls to go elsewhere, but most of us stayed for as long as we did, and Bob had a lot to do with that. I'll just end on two other reflections. One is today, I have a busy job like many of us, and Steve knows this. We have a crisis almost every day. And when in crisis, there's one of those rules that every day serves to guide me. And this has to do with, he said something like, when something happens, please place the least dramatic interpretation about why it happened. And I cannot tell you how important that rule is in my job, but also in my life, having teenage kids and such. It truly, more than any rule, it has really served me well in my life and in my job. The second reflection I have has to do with, the person and the love. And basically, it is about relationships ultimately. You know, what we do and the time we pass. Yes, we have papers, we have awards, we have titles, but ultimately it's about the people. And I'll end on that note, that it's always about the people. And so Marilyn, thank you for helping us come here. Thank you for being an amazing person. We miss Bob. And I'll end on a note of deep gratitude personally, admiration and respect, but ultimately love for you and Bob. We really, Lolita and I, both love both of you deeply, and thank you for everything. And we miss Bob also. Thank you, Andres.
Thank you, Ravi. You know, as being Puerto Rican and being very calm, I use that rule of the least dramatic interpretation probably on an hourly basis, and I think it has served me well. Ravi, what you said, you know, Bob was the ultimate chess master. He could see moves, you know, years ahead. I can share with you tremendous stories where he played me unbelievably well. But I remember when he was recruiting Michelle and I, right? So we were joint hires or two-body solutions, like he called it. You know, we were grad students living in Philadelphia. We're at the University of Pennsylvania. And our oldest son was already born, and Bob will always call us at 6:30 at night, right? And why? Because that's where we were at our weakest, right? Our son was on the wheelchair, on the high chair. wielding peanuts and peas and carrots all over the kitchen. The cats were running around. We were hungry, right? We're stressed out. But that's where he knew that we were at our weakest, and he would just make sure that we would agree to things without being able to think about them properly. So I tried to learn that technique and apply it to it. The other thing about people is, so our sons, right, being Michelle and I both faculty members here, our sons spend a lot of time at Georgia Tech, right? Because, you know, daycare wasn't great, and we came to my office. In fact, my oldest son had taped part of my desk as his desk, and then he decided he was gonna kick the faculty member next door and take over his office. But we would go to these events, and we would say, boys, you gotta get ready. I have two sons. Boys, you gotta get ready. We're going to Georgia Tech for an event, right? And they would ask, they would stop what they were doing, and they would ask, is Bob Nerem gonna be there? Okay, and that was really, to them, the highlight of the visit to Georgia Tech was to come and see Bob Nerem, because it would be fun. There's an epic time that Bob got in a food fight with one of my sons at one of the events, and you know, that really reflects sort of the character of Bob, that he really made everybody special, right? Not just the parents, not only the faculty, but the entire family. So, okay, so the next speaker is going to be Bill Wepfer. Bill, great to see you. Bill was a long-time Georgia Tech faculty member, and he was the chair of mechanical engineering for many years. He was my chair, and worked closely with Bob in keeping all of us straight.
Thank you, Andres, and it's great to be here. I would like to share with you my sort of judgment, or my aspect, or my assessment of what I think is Bob's most significant and spectacular contribution to Georgia Tech. He joined the faculty, as the video said, in about 1987, and we were good. We were maybe even very good. And those of us on the faculty at the time, we had aspirations. We wanted to be better. We wanted to be more elite. We wanted to be great. But frankly, at that time, we didn't know how to be great. So Bob joined us, and Bob, you know, has this incredibly great personality. I mean, he's got incredible empathy, a great sense of humor, and I think Bob's greatest contribution is he taught us how to believe in ourselves. He would always ask the perfect question. And I have an anecdote. I think it's true, although I have witnesses in the crowd that can verify or deny it. But after Bob joined, we were trying to build up faculty because we needed faculty. And as you can appreciate, in mechanical engineering, one of our focus areas was going to be the biomechanics area. So we had interviewed some spectacular young people, including, you know, Bob Goldberg, Andres Garcia, Michelle LaPlaca, and of course, you know, faculty recruiting is an interesting process. And of course, at a faculty meeting, somebody says, well, which one of these people are we going to hire? And thank God Bob was able to say, come on, don't think about it that way. We hire them all. And I think that's just a way that, it's a small anecdote about how Bob taught us how we could aspire and get to be great. So I will forever be, you know, thankful for that contribution of Bob, because it's one thing to have an aspiration, but then it's another thing to do it. So in summary, Bob has my vote as a first ballot Hall of Famer in the Human Being Hall of Fame, and he has my first ballot vote in the Georgia Tech Hall of Fame. And I want to thank the Nerem family. Thank you so much for sharing Bob with us. I know he lives on in your lives, and I think one of the secret sauces for Georgia Tech will be to keep Bob's memory living on in Georgia Tech's culture and Georgia Tech's future.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to say a few words about our friend Bob Nerem. I say our because my wife, Julie, and I have been friends of Bob in Maryland for 30 years or so. Bob was a good and valued friend, generous, friendly, as well as a visionary leader. Of course, Julie and I wish that Bob were here in the flesh, but his spirit is alive in all that he has touched. Initially, I became acquainted with Bob at national meetings. We seemed to click because we had the same vision for the future importance of technology in biology and medicine, and were enthusiastic about finding ways wherein universities could prepare students to become valued actors in addressing healthcare needs. Starting in the mid-90s, many nascent bioengineering departments were forming at universities all over the country. At that time, many engineering deans couldn't spell biomedical engineering, and it was a little bit chaotic. The vision for creating this new engineer, the bioengineer, competent in both engineering and biology, meant that new courses needed to be created. Many new emerging faculty cohorts were comprised of engineers, physicians, chemists, and biologists. To effectively teach newly designed courses, integrating the respective disciplines, resulted in an unmet need for new teaching materials, specifically aimed at training the bioengineer. So the Whitaker Foundation organized and funded a bioengineering teaching materials program. Bob and I were appointed to the committee, and Bob was the first committee chair. The foundation generously invited spouses to attend the meetings, and Jillian and I became good friends of Bob and Marilyn over the next several years. Bob had a big sense of humor. It might have been at one of the first foundation dinners that I had the opportunity to acknowledge that Bob was indeed a giant in the field of bioengineering. And then he discovered the Dr. Atkins diet. When I moved to DC to join the foundation, we got to see a lot more of Bob and Marilyn on their frequent trips to town for other meetings. Bob and Marilyn are blessed with many good friends. Why, we even had the opportunity to host a birthday party at our house in Arlington, attended by, quotes, a cast of thousands, unquote. Bob was very generous. I picked up the wine and he picked up the tab. When Bob and others rotated off the Teaching Materials Committee, he was instrumental in forming WAS, the Whitaker Alumni Society. Couples on the committee had become good friends, and we continued that friendship by enjoying several vacations together in such places as Napa Valley, Santa Fe, Quebec, and even Shebag Island up in Maine. Bob was selfless in volunteering his time to serve on lots of national and international committees over the years. I once asked him why, and he responded, "They need my help, and they are my friends." Even as it became difficult for him to travel, he made a heroic effort to attend. Most recently, and just before COVID struck and Zoom replaced airplanes, Bob and I attended the NIBIB Advisory Council Future Strategic Planning meeting. Bob never stopped. He was indeed a giant. And as the song says, for those listening who are old enough to remember, those were the days, my friend. We thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we choose. We'd fight and never lose, for we were young and sure to have our way. In closing, Julie and I send our sympathy to the Nerem family and especially our hugs to Marilyn. We certainly wish we were there with you in person. Thank you.
Thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this celebration. It is an honor and pleasure to be among friends and distinguished colleagues, some I have not seen for a decade. or more. No doubt I'm here because of my past work for the Whitaker Foundation, an organization that was created in 1976, shortly after the death of Uncas Whitaker, an engineer and entrepreneur. He believed that engineering contributions to medicine are potentially groundbreaking, and such collaborations should be encouraged and supported. To honor Whitaker's wish and vision, in 1991, the foundation decided to close in 2006 and to spend all its considerable assets to enhance the field of biomedical engineering. I was fortunate to be hired to participate in this effort during the foundation's last 15 years. What does this have to do with the Nerem Symposium? My main point today is to emphasize that the goals and activities of Bob and the foundation complemented each other remarkably well, helping to lead our profession to its current high standing. In addition to supporting junior faculty members, the Whitaker Foundation focused on strengthening existing biomedical engineering programs and supported the creation of new and pioneering departments, often with considerable investment that were to be matched, at least partially, by the recipient institution. Bob's vision was somewhat different. He advocated upgrading traditional engineering education by adding life science content to the curriculum. One of Bob's famous statements was that biomedical engineering is too important to leave it to biomedical engineering departments. Strongly stated and perceptive, this view complemented Whitaker's efforts and contributed additional means of increasing engineering interaction with the life sciences for the benefit of all. Responding to concerns that biomedical engineering and related fields were represented by numerous, often competing organizations, Bob, in collaboration with Arthur Johnson, initiated an effort to establish a professional organization that would broadly represent those individuals and societies that were dedicated to the interaction of engineering with the life sciences and medicine. I recall intensive discussions and arguments that often focused on the appropriate designation for the new organization. Bob's open-minded and collaborative leadership circumvented a potential failure, eventually leading to the 1991 founding of AIMBY, the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. In retrospect, I admire the outcome. The name AIMBY includes the range from the most applied medical to the most basic biological areas for engineering input. I believe that the creation of AIMBY, bringing united voice to our diverse field, is one of Bob's most widely recognized contributions. Lastly, I need to mention the establishment of the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering at the NIH, signed into law by President Bill Clinton on December 29, 2000. This has probably been the most significant event impacting our field. Was this event due to Bob's advocacy? No. Was it due to efforts by the Whitaker Foundation? Definitely no. Rather, this event was the result of all the joint and complementary activities that had already demonstrated that integrating engineering and the life sciences holds major promise for revolutionizing healthcare. Bob's advocacy, AIMBY's visibility, Whitaker's grant programs, and the innovative research and educational activities so many of you pursued all contributed to NIBIB's establishment. I feel honored that I'm amongst you, major contributors to the field ranging from biological to medical engineering. I also feel delighted and fortunate that the program today includes remarks by Rod Pettigrew, the first director of NIBIB, as well as by Bruce Stromberg, its current leader. Their participation is evidence for the success of the field that Bob Nerem spearheaded. Congratulations to Georgia Tech and Emory for the roles they have played and are playing, bringing about this success. And many thanks for listening.
Our next speaker is Roderick Pettigrew, who used to be at Emory. He's a past director of NIBIB and is currently the CEO of InHealth and the Argo Dean of Engineering in Medicine at Texas A&M University. Hopefully I got all of that, Rod.
Excellent, and thank you, and I'm going to try to avoid the gong and the hook. As Andreas mentioned, I was at Emory, and I knew, and Georgia Tech, and I knew Bob then in the 1990s, but it was really when I transitioned to NIBIB that Bob and I became quite close. I immediately reached out to Bob to join NIB in the role of a special advisor to me as NIBIB director. And we did that officially. He actually made regular trips to Washington, contributing to his time at the airport that was mentioned before. Bob had been a stalwart leader of Beacon, and you'll hear more about that from Bruce Stromberg. But Bob also was the first person to talk to me scientifically about the emerging field of tissue engineering and regenerative medicine. And my background had been in cardiovascular imaging with MR and fluid flow and dynamics, but it was Bob who schooled me and taught me about regenerative medicine, and you can see he co-authored an early text, co-edited an early text with Tony Atala on that. Speaking of Bob's leadership, and you know, all of us that are speaking in this first group are listed under this title, leadership, and I really want to reflect on my experience with Bob and exposure to him and his leadership. But he played a critical role in so many things, one of which was actually crafting the first mission statement of NIBIB. We spent at a retreat 2 solid days working on our strategic plan, and believe it or not, the first entire day was spent on just crafting the mission statement, parsing every word. And we had spent a lot of time talking about technological innovation and healthcare and medical technologies and so forth and how we would drive that. But it was Bob who stood up and said, there is a missing concept in this statement, and that missing concept is the leadership that this institute is playing and will play. And so as a result, that word leading, to improve health by leading the development, the word leading is a direct result of Bob in his statement. And I've thought about that over the years whenever I cited the mission statement at that time, which continued for the first 2 strategic plans. In our 5th and 10th anniversaries, Bob was present and played a role. Bruce also will talk about that as well. But at the 10th anniversary, I had the opportunity to recognize 14 visionaries of NIBIB, we call them, with an official citation you see there. And one of those 14 was of course, Bob Nerem, who was one of those individuals who played such a monumental role in helping to create NIBIB. I was also delighted to have been a co-author with Bob, not only a paper, but this forward-looking paper positing engineering as a new frontier for translational medicine. And in this, it had one of my favorite phrases that I even live by now. And that is, the goal is to integrate engineering into medicine and medicine into engineering until boundaries vanish. That was such a beautiful phrase, and I'm still pursuing that. We know Bob was a humanist. We heard about this, and that was illustrated in this beautiful homage that he wrote to his friend and colleague, Pierre Galetti, for whom the top prize of AMBI is named. And this slide, you probably think, Bob was a man of many talents. Maybe I'm going to say he played tennis with Venus Williams at Wimbledon. But that didn't happen. But Bob was one of the reasons and partly responsible for me actually attending Wimbledon and seeing Venus Williams, even though I arrived in London with no plans to go to Wimbledon. But I ran into Bob in Maryland, and he was coming back, and I was going to the Royal College, and he told me, you can go to Wimbledon, and he told me what steps to do. You don't have tickets, don't worry, here's what you do. I followed his prescription. I got in, and I got to center court, and I saw Venus Williams. And he also told me, he said, when you go, you have to have strawberries and cream. So that's what that picture is there. That's part of the Wimbledon experience. I never would have known that otherwise, but I went out and sought out strawberries and cream. So I'm going to end with this classic question here, and I'm calling this the Nerem question. I can't take credit for this. I heard this before, but it resonated so much that I repeated it many times in Bob's presence, and he loved it. So the question is, what is the difference between Bob Nerem and God? God is everywhere. Bob Nerem was everywhere except Georgia Tech. And I gotta tell you, I told this so many times, and in his presence, and the person who laughed the loudest was Bob. So I just want to conclude, by being everywhere, he inspired so many people. He touched us all. And it's been said that when you teach others and you inspire and you educate the next generation, you can actually touch eternity. And in that way, Bob has. Thank you.
That was great. I love that joke, and Bob never had a comeback for that, which was, I think that's the only time, he knew it was true. So next, I'm very happy to have Susan Margulies come up. Susan was at the University of Pennsylvania. Actually, I did my teaching practicum with Susan, and she's always been a great mentor and friend, and we were very happy when she joined Georgia Tech as the chair of the BME department between Georgia Tech and Emory. And most recently, she's, I guess, on loan from Georgia Tech and Emory. She is the director of the head of the engineering directorate at NSF, but she's a close friend of Bob's at Maryland. So, Susan, welcome.
Thank you. Just to build on Rod's comment, as chair of BME here, I had to approve partial use of one of our administrative assistants for Bob. And it was, he was long past retirement, and he needed percent of her, I forget, something like 25%. And I said, what does she do for him? files his travel reimbursement. I loved it. I said, okay, we will honor Bob that way. So I have known Bob since the mid-'80s. Bob is my academic grandfather. He actually served on the committee of my dissertation advisor and Michelle's dissertation advisor as well. So I wrote down some thoughts because I wanted to make sure that my stories, which go back a long way, actually are shared with you. I see that many of my stories resonate with many of yours. So today, we celebrate a life well lived. Bob was a fearless hero, a visionary who was grounded in humility and humanity with a mystical soul. He lived and loved in full color, at full speed, and simultaneously, it seemed to me, in suspended animation. I knew no other person who could have such a busy schedule and make me feel like the clock stopped when I was with him. Von Karman, who is the recipient of the National Medal of Science, said, "Scientists study the world as it is, and engineers create the world that has never been." A consummate engineer and leader, Bob had the ability to see what was and to see what needed to be. And he had the wisdom and the intellect to recognize a variety of paths that could be taken to reach that futuristic goal. Bob could articulate, as you have heard, a compelling vision to a diverse range of groups of supporters, and he could create an overwhelming army of support. I always admired Bob's ability to be very plain-spoken about matters that were very complex. His ability to speak from the heart, to create urgency, and his laser focus on unleashing the real potential for engineering to drive impact in health and disease. Combine that impressive list with the fact that Bob was also wise, smart, with a generous heart and a quick wit, Bob is a role model to me. Bob's also a role model to me as a mentor and a champion. It's fitting that the Mentor Award for the ASME BD is named after Bob, and we'll hear more about that today. Traditionally, a mentor is synonymous with a teacher. However, Bob understood that although faculty don't like to be taught, we love to learn. Bob helped me learn about myself. He helped me appreciate my uniqueness. He helped me embrace serendipitous opportunities in life's journey. He was prescient. He often articulated truths about myself that I didn't even know or realize yet. My application for the Coulter BME chair was an example. I would not have applied, but as you heard earlier, Bob is a very persuasive recruiter. And he called me, I don't know if it was at 6:30 at night, multiple times to help me see how I could make a difference here. More recently, Bob's was the voice in my head when I heard and I was asked to apply to lead the NSF Engineering Directorate. And again, I listened to him. Many of you count Bob as your friend, your mentor, your champion. However, I realize, and I hope you do too, the truth is, Bob picked us. And we were all smart enough to accept that gracious gift. His love and support was so critical to all of us, and that's what brings us here today. With Bob as my role model, my promise now and in the future is to, like Bob, leave the world and the people in it a better place than we found it. Bob was deeply philosophical about connections. We've heard again and again, he put people first. His rules of life, I encourage you to look at it, is a seamless integration of his life's passions and his values. I love them. I look back, many of you know I'm a saver, so I look back. What is my earliest email from Bob? And I save emails going back multiple institutions. My earliest email was 1998. And Bob reached out to me in a very challenging time in my life. And his messages were steeped in rules 1, 4, and 15, which I will tell you, that life is all about having an experimental learning mindset. It is about looking for other doors that might be open. And yes, taking the least dramatic interpretation on an event. Our conversations in his last year were filled with his health challenges, and they steeped of Rule 17, which is making peace with who you are at this moment. We all know that Bob's superpower and lens to the world is Marilyn. Marilyn, as I've grown to know you better, I admire your tenacity, your holistic approach to life, and your authenticity. I'm deeply grateful for your unconditional love and support to me and to my family. I care deeply about you, and I'm here to support you. When Bob greeted me, and probably all of you, he said, "Hello, friend." With a twinkle in his eye, those words always enveloped me like a hug and drew me in. Those were his last words to me as I entered his hospital room just before he died, and I treasure how those words continue to resonate with me, emblematic of his continued presence as my role model, my mentor, and my friend. Gilda Radner once said, "I wanted a perfect ending. Now I've learned the hard way that some poems don't rhyme, that some stories don't have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Life is about not knowing, having to change, taking the moment and making the best of it without knowing what's going to happen next. Delicious ambiguity." Bob, your story certainly does not have an end. You remain in our thoughts, our hearts, and our deeds. I, like many of you here, continue to think, what would Bob say? Bob, your life well lived is like a compass for each of us, guiding us through delicious ambiguity. In closing, I'd like to paraphrase rule number 19. The way you lead your life is your gift to all of us and those who come after you. Thank you, Bob, for leaving us your precious gift.
To introduce our next speaker, Bruce Stromberg, who's the director of NIBIB and has known Bob for many years. So Bruce, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks so much to Georgia Tech and the Nerem family for giving me this very special opportunity. And I think Andres said Bruce's lecture, and I guess I do. I'm a government official, so I will give a lecture. And you know, as I was putting this together, it occurred to me, and I think this theme has come out throughout the day. Bob professionally looked at multi-scale phenomena and was very excited and interested in models. And Bob himself was a multi-scale model, a role model for all of us. And the scales of his impact and his attributes span from individuals, and I love this quote from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'll just read it. Bob found renewal through investing in people. He became friends with waiters and desk clerks, those he met in the elevator. He was a mentor to countless graduate students and fellow researchers. He often spent his spare time helping friends with personal matters. And then there's the other spatial scale, institutions, which we're all very familiar with. And this is a really great quote, I think, from IUPESM. Bob dedicated his life as a champion for biomedical engineering. He strongly advocated integration, bringing BME communities around the world together collectively with one voice to effectively raise public policy issues. Bob was instrumental in the creation of NIH's National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. So I'll first start exploring that latter theme, Bob's special role. And of course, as Peter Katona pointed out, there were many, many people over many decades. You know, we stand on many shoulders of giants and their contributions. But I want to go into some detail and go into the archives and pull out some original material of what Bob did and how he contributed. It's a very interesting story. So my sources for this, of course, are the famous Public Law 106-580. Everybody should know that and memorize it, the content. So President Clinton signed this into law December 29th, 2000. This is the NIBIB Establishment Act. And then there's this wonderful Annals of Biomedical Engineering paper by Bill Hendy, Xu Chen, Doug Maynard, and Donna Dean that has a very nice linear account of many of the steps that led ultimately to this act, and then the subsequent standing up of the Institute and the hiring of Dr. Pettigrew as the founding director of NIBIB. Now, 5 years after the formation and the standing up of the Institute, Dr. Pettigrew held a symposium. This was on June 1st, 2007. Thank goodness, Rod, that you had this symposium. And I have now excerpted quite a lot of clips from this to help put things in context, but to put you all in the move, and I will not show the entire 6 hours of the symposium. I'd like to start out with a flashback.
It is my
Rod.
genuine privilege and pleasure to welcome everyone to this landmark scientific symposium marking the 5th anniversary of the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering as a congressionally appropriated member institute of the National Institutes of Health. This institute was conceived and created to provide a home for the discovery of new technologies, new techniques, and new approaches to solving the major challenges that we face in the healthcare system today.
So I think that gives us the context for some of the things that we're about to see. To really understand Bob's role, you have to really go back to his role in the creation of AMBI. So he was a co-founder of AMBI and first president between 1992 and 1994. And you can see him here with HHS Secretary, Dr. Sullivan. And you can listen to, in Bob's words, the kind of sausage making that was taking place at the time and how this was actually stood up.
Funded a process that led to the formation of AMBI, the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. I still remember being in an office with a few people, the office of the Assistant Director for Engineering at NSF, John White at the time, and John looked at us at the end of the meeting and said, I never see you again. And I said, John, why do you say that? He says, well, you mechanical engineers are in today. Next week, it's going to be the electrical engineers, and the week after that, it'll be the chemical engineers. And if you people don't get your act together, you're never going to have an influence anywhere in Washington. Well, he was willing to put his money where his mouth was speaking and funded this process that led through a series of steps to the formation of AMBI, with the inaugural event being held in February 1992.
So let's linger on that. If you want to have influence in Washington, and that clearly was at top of mind for Bob and colleagues at the time to have influence, and that's exactly what they did. They went to Congress and very, very quickly were responsible for driving this very important paragraph, a section within this public law, which is 103-43, I believe, the 103rd Congress. And it's a small section that is called Support for Bioengineering Research. So AMBI was driving this with Congress. Later on, the Academy for Radiology Research got very deeply involved and teamed up with AMBI in order to help drive the formation. But let's go back to this pivotal moment, this very obscure paragraph in a very long bill that's sort of the recommitment to the NIH. That was the general topic of the bill. So in this particular paragraph, Congress mandates that the HHS secretary, acting through the NIH director, needs to figure out what's going on with bioengineering in the United States, like how much money is being spent on this, and whether this is sufficient to keep the United States in the lead. And what about the NIH? What is the NIH doing for bioengineering? We knew that there were some activities, but somebody needed to come together and really figure out quantitatively what the story is, and then make a determination about whether federal agencies could coordinate better and how they could work with the private sector, with professional societies, and with academic institutions to really drive this forward. So that was the simple charge in a very brief, bulleted, numbered, elegantly stated paragraph. And guess who got the job of leading that external committee? Bob Nerem. So he chaired the External Consultants Committee, and listen to Bob in his own voice talk about that.
That I would like to bring to your attention. One was that NIH should establish a central focus for bioengineering at the highest level. Secondly, NIH should significantly expand bioengineering representation on advisory groups and in the peer review process. And NIH should establish an intramural bioengineering research program. A year later, due to some ways, I guess, the intervention of Senator Bill Frist, the NIH report was released. That had 4 recommendations, but 2 that I'll call to your attention here. It didn't talk about the highest level. It talked about NIH should establish an interagency bioengineering coordinating committee, and that NIH institutes and centers should include basic bioengineering research with the appropriate intramural program. Clearly, the powers to be at NIH were not prepared to take the steps that the external community thought needed to be done.
So there you may have detected a little bit of the tension in his voice between the recommendations of the External Consultants Committee and what the NIH had then stood up was BCON. And we'll go into that theme and explore it just a little bit more in just a second, but I think this is captured in this 1999 Chronicle article, which quotes Mr. Nerem's external panel. However, that is in contrast to what the NIH thought things should be, had bigger changes in mind. And here's a quote directly from Bob. Without a central focus for the discipline at the highest levels of the agency, the field will continue to suffer from fragmentation and lack of coordination that could impede and delay future advances. At some point, you have to take this ad hoc activity and give it a real home. That means an institute, or as part of an expanded mission for an existing institute, or a freestanding center, but there needs to be a permanent home for bioengineering research at the NIH. So this moment and this tension is so important. I have this extended quote from Bob.
That's an important step. But was there to be a next step? What did Varmus mean when in his 1997 memo he talked about preparing for the future of this emerging area? Was it the establishment of NIBIB? Well, quite frankly, I don't think that's what Varmus had in mind. Because I remember a meeting organized by Wendy Baldwin. A few of us met with Varmus, and I tried to convince Varmus with the following argument. I said, you know, at a university, the way you get things going is find an individual to be a champion, and you've got a champion in Wendy Baldwin. You put an ad hoc committee together, and that gets things off a dead center, and you begin to move. But that does not provide the long-term stability needed to really have an effective effort. And I said, at some point, NIH is going to have to step up to the plate and provide that long-range stability. Well, of course, there were a lot of people, not only within NIH, but even outside of NIH, that were opposed to creation of more institutes. That's always been an issue, and understandably so. But I don't think it was Varmus's idea for that to happen.
So I can just imagine Bob in Harold Varmus's office saying, you know, at some point, NIH is going to have to step up to the plate. But, you know, clearly there was this opposition. But, in fact, NIBIB did form, and we have our public law to support that. And in the last part of Bob's presentation, he looks forward to NIBIB's challenges and really comments on the state of bioengineering, and this is 2007 at that time. So let's listen.
I will make one further comment just about bioengineering today as a final comment. Clearly, this has evolved into a discipline in its own right, and there's many ways, as Dr. Sahurni has pointed out in his talk this morning, as to how not only can we be involved to make a contribution, but actually be leaders as we move into 21st century medicine. It is a significant part of this country's biomedical engineering community. In the U.S., there are now 79 biomedical engineering, bioengineering PhD programs that are going through the NRC assessment. But most importantly, the best and the brightest engineering students want to do bioengineering. And they really are our future. And I'm glad that the previous speaker, Dr. Magoulas, talked about the mentoring issue. Clearly what we want are young people who are well enough trained to be able to do things, but not so well trained to realize that it can't be done, because the impossible can become possible, and that's an important role for NIBIB. Stan Baum, it's all yours.
So that is a theme, I think, that imbues our discipline, both the student training and this idea, the impossible can become possible. And that's an important role for our community and for the NIBIB. And I'll come back to that. So Jack Linehan mentioned strategic planning. And when I first came to NIBIB in January of 2019, Jack and Bob were on council. And I came with a lot of enthusiasm to start a strategic planning process. And within a few months, we had established a program with more than 20 members of our strategic planning group, 7 different areas and topics. Bob really was enthusiastic about participating, and he was part of Group 1B, Engineered Biology, of course. And I challenged everyone to really simplify some of these messages, because I think my colleagues in other institutes are not really that adept at understanding what does it mean developing technologies. I felt like we needed to really get into engineering the future of health, which is our vision now, simplified, and have a mission that talks about preventing disease, curing disease. And actually, I got a lot of pushback. You know, you're not necessarily allowed to say we're going to cure disease. It's a hard one. And detecting disease better. So I wanted to get those themes in, but I didn't quite have the language of the mission statement. Little did I know, and as Rod has pointed out, Bob was a veteran from that 2003 to 2006 period of the battles of crafting the mission statement, and Bob had contributed enormously to that. Well, Bob couldn't actually attend a critical meeting where we were talking about the crafting of the mission statement. He was not able to travel, but he sent me this email and said, give me a call. This actually came on the day of our council meeting, so I called him a little after that. And what we talked about was how to actually modify that mission statement. And it was really an easy conversation, because this is the mission statement Bob gave me. And it was perfect. So the mission of the NIBIB is to transform, through engineering, the understanding of disease and its prevention, detection, diagnosis, and treatment. Perfect. And that was Bob's another legacy contribution to NIBIB. I was so appreciative of that. That's on our website, and it's something that my colleagues in all the other institutes absolutely understand and relate to. Now, we have many more words that are technical in nature that follow after that, but this is the key lead-in. We have a vision, engineering the future of health, and a mission statement that is really beautifully consistent, and that's thanks to Bob. So what happened to our strategic planning process? In February of 2020, the pandemic hit, and we really put it on hold. As we at the NIBIB focused on imaging and artificial intelligence, in vitro diagnostics, and digital health platforms as a way for us as a community to be able to make a significant contribution to the pandemic response. And what happened, to our surprise, really, although we were prepared for it, was that Congress, and again, another public law, 116-139, also known as the 4th Congressional Supplement, awarded NIH $1.5 billion to expand COVID diagnostics, testing technologies. And in that, $500 million actually went to the NIBIB. And you can see from this plot that far exceeded our base appropriations. So immediately, like a startup that suddenly gets a huge amount of funding, we had NIBIB 1, which is our core programs, and NIBIB 2, which we were able to focus and contribute in these 3 major areas. And part of the challenge over the course of the pandemic has been the changing pandemic. So even though we started with what seemed like a lot of money, we were able to get money from other agencies and rebudgeting from the Office of Management and Budget. So now in total, we've received $1.7 billion, our community, to make these contributions to the pandemic. And what are they? And then I'm not gonna go into the details of all this stuff, but we built our response around an existing network. And I go back to 2007 when Rod had that event and actually launched the very first point of care technology research network, or POCTERN. This is a cooperative group of multiple institutions. If we didn't have NIBIB, if we didn't have that network, the nation would not have been in a position to be ready to respond. So we took this network, POCTERN, which had just been renewed in 2019 when I got to NIBIB, and expanded it dramatically. We sent out a call to the innovation and entrepreneurial community, said we need help. So we started with our core institutions, which you see Georgia Tech Emory is one of them, and we increased this to more than 900 participants in academics, in industry, in not-for-profit foundations, and our whole mission was to dramatically expand testing capacity, scope, the use cases that we could respond to, because at the time, in April of 2020, the country was doing maybe 8 million tests a month. So many different functionalities in all of this, and many different programs that we launched, most famously probably our innovation funnel, or the Shark Tank, as has been sort of politically noted by leadership, Senator Alexander and Senator Blunt. And one of the pivotal, really, pieces of this, and I'm here at Georgia Tech Emory, and I really have to point this out. I spent yesterday with Wilbur Lamb and colleagues in their amazing center. This center has made enormous contributions. If any of you have gotten a test from the post office, from covid.gov, or actually used anything commercially, this center has evaluated the performance of that test and reported it to the FDA and certified it for every variant, and allowed us to make recommendations to the Department of Defense for purchasing and procurements. So it's not a well-known story, as we in the engineering world, we don't have well-known stories, but this is absolutely essential. Without this contribution, we wouldn't have had the diagnostic tests in people's homes, in point of care, with validated and understandable performance that we do have. So this is an amazing, amazing center and an amazing place, and I really wanted to point that out. So what's the net impact of all this? This whole program has been responsible for creating 3 billion tests to date, increasing testing capacity, which is a number that I find ridiculously large and impossible to think about, but it's helped drive an interesting paradigm shift. If you go back to the time of the beginning of the pandemic, and for much of laboratory medicine, or medicine itself, it takes place in labs, and it's done by order of physicians. Now, in the peak of the demand, when Omicron was truly surging in February of 2022, there were 1 billion over-the-counter tests that were distributed for people to use in their homes. We are now at a sort of steady state in the hundreds of millions. And this is a consequence of the biomedical engineering community, the technology development community, coming together and not just thinking, let's build a prototype, but let's go to manufacturing. Let's figure out how to work with the FDA to get authorization. So it's an entirely new approach, a new way of thinking, and has driven a paradigm shift, and really makes you think of the impossible can become possible. And that's an important role for NIBIB. Bob saw that, and we got called off the bench, so to speak, in a time of great national stress to be able to make this contribution. As we look forward, we have our canonical areas that have been articulated by all of you, our whole community, over the years, has been captured in publications, and Bob has been a key contributor to this, particularly in engineered biology. So we want to RADXify the NIH and NIBIB to be able to facilitate these kinds of advances in all these other areas so we can achieve our goals for our community and for society. So I talked about the multi-scale Bob, and I've talked a lot about institution. I just would like to conclude with a personal individual anecdote. 20 years ago, Bob was a member of our external advisory board at the University of California, Irvine for our Whitaker Foundation grant, our development award, and we were having a site visit, and Steve George was the chair of the department. He was probably about 36 at the time and an assistant professor. I was the vice chair and the interim director of the Beckman Laser Institute. And I think we had a pretty good plan, and we had a great site visit. Peter was there, of course, and Jack, and Bob was there. And some questions came up, and Bob went straight for the apex of the leadership structure, as he does, with a penetrating question. And he started out, and it's indelible in my memory. He says, to the provost, your leadership is really young. And I looked at Steve, and we looked at each other and thought, uh-oh, where is this going? And he said, they may get recruited to other universities or campuses, and your plans really revolve around their ability to carry out their vision. What do you have to say about that? And for those of you who've been in site visits, sometimes provosts knock it out of the park, and sometimes, well, let's just say, you never know. And the provost looked at us, he looked at Bob, and he said, we are absolutely dedicated to Steve and Bruce. We are going to bring all the resources that we need to bring to make this program and department a success, and we're committed to their growth and career at UC Irvine as long as they can, for many, many years to come. So I looked at Steve and I said, I wasn't even sure if the provost really knew my name exactly. And I was just astounded. First, I'd never heard anybody ask a question like that in that kind of public setting with everybody there. And the dean of engineering is looking at the provost and kind of, I think, getting excited because the provost controls all the resources. So within 6 months, I had become the permanent director of the Beckman Laser Institute. Steve went from assistant to associate professor, and guess who wrote one of his letters for him? Bob. And we formed a department, which is 20 years old now, and we've been talking throughout this symposium about the connectedness of things across space and time, and that event, which is indelible in my mind, a really pivotal event. And I've used that technique now personally in various site visits subsequently. We learned from Bob in so many ways, and we benefited from Bob in the questions that he asked, the expectations that he set for all of us, and to think the impossible can become possible. So thank you all very much.